Jesus freak here, and phrase that's come up a few times on social media recently for me is Church of Tares. Now, I understand, people have their different preferences of worship style. I've gotten into my own opinions on this. But I'll give you an example of one situation where I went into a church and I was just cringing the whole time. I was visiting family in Oswego, New York. Now, I live about 3 hours from there. And I hadn't seen them in about 25 years. Long story. Anyway, I was visiting them, and I decided to go to the nearest church of my persuasion, which was also the nearest church, full stop, Lycoming United Methodist Church. Now, I went in there. Okay, you got the usual hymnals, Bibles stuffed in the pews. Believe it or not, the Bibles were kind of old King James Bibles. Now, I was sitting there. They had the radio on through the PA system. Already I was starting to cringe. What do you need a radio for? So, service started, and, they're doing this happy, clappy, kiddie music. And I was cringing at that. And then they went on, they did the scripture reading out of some paraphrastic translation. I have no idea which one it was, but the words had no connection with the any of the translations I've ever heard, and I'm familiar with a lot of translations. I mean, just because I use a King James in most of my videos, it doesn't really mean much. But they were using one of those newfangled modern paraphrastic translations, like, the word, the message, or, something along those lines. And the pastor and the guy reading the scripture used different translations. And I think his was even more paraphrastic. And the message was just another, happy clappy one. And the more I was listening, the more I cringed. And when my dad and I left, I told him, I was tempted to walk out. This is the kind of thing I call the Church of Tares, that they seem more interested in trying to please the audience than, to actually satisfy them. The phrase Church of Tares, the word tare is an obsolete word. I believe the modern term is darnel, but that's a less known one. It's a weed that kind of looks like wheat while it's growing. This is mentioned in Matthew 13. Anyway, I've seen to varying degrees these issues in a lot of the churches I've attended. And ironically, considering that a lot of people have negative opinions of Methodists, The church I go to now, St. James United Methodist in Niagara Falls, um, probably is the most aligned church I've been to, even if they are a little more, liberal than you'd probably figure, because, Methodists are more liberal than Baptists in general. And, I mean, I don't agree with everything they say and do, but they're a lot closer than a lot of the other churches I've been to. They use a relatively uh, straightforward translation. I don't exactly like the NIV, especially not in its current form. But if you stack it against, the NLT and even worse, the Message and the Passion Translation and stuff like that, it's actually a rather straight one in comparison. So I can deal. And the minister's style of preaching is to basically, mix going through the passage again and making relevant commentary at the same time. Um, and as you've seen, that's kind of the way I like to roll too, and I think it's ideal because it's focusing first and foremost on the one thing that needs to be focused on. Now, ideally, I'd use a more straight translation, like if not the King James or the New King James, and at least the New American Standard or ESV or one of those. But I can deal. And even though they'll do, one praise chorus during the service, most of the time we're doing the old classic hymns. There's no shortage of Watts or Wesley in the hymns we do. Now personally, I'd probably have a wider selection of hymns than we use. We'll probably only use maybe 20 of them during the year total, and just, keep using the same ones over and over. But in fact, it's gotten to the point I've actually been able to predict sometimes exactly which hymns they choose. But that's not a bad thing. For example, I'm recording this the day after Easter, Dingus Day we call it out here. Just so I didn't forget Poland. In joke. Anyway, but we did Christ the Lord is Risen Today, which, that's an obvious choice. And Low in the Gravy Lay, another pretty obvious one. And, I mean, I'm fine with this. I've said, if I were to have to move, I'd really like to stick to the existing, I don't want to change churches when I move, because I like how this church is, as well as, I've got a few friends there. And I know, that's not a few friends is really not a good excuse, but, if I feel that, the Spirit of God is moving through the church, even if, the people in the pews are kind of dead, I can still feel the Spirit moving in the rest of the church. And that's a good thing. I go to another church where, it's all happy clappy. These are the days of Elijah. A lot of stuff that really feels like it's trying to be worldly or trying to be, a lot of churches, they feel a little patronizing, I guess you could say. It puts me off. And I'd rather be with a church like I'm with. And I tend to think that these are just superior churches in general to the others. And as I've demonstrated, this is not a matter of one denomination versus another, because this whole range is within one denomination. Although I've been to, non-denominational churches, Pentecostal churches, which I have a different problem with, Baptist churches, crypto-Baptist churches, and I mean, I don't exactly feel that I'm within one realm of, when I call myself a Methodist, I'm not saying, that I strictly follow John Wesley or whatever. This saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. It's not that. I'm basically saying that my understanding of scriptural matters and such tends to reflect a similar interpretation to Wesley's, and I understand, it's not exactly the same. Wesley kept to a lot of the Church of England practices. I mean, he never left the Church of England. Neither did his brother. They died in the Church of England. But I do have differences of opinion with them sometimes. For example, they practiced infant baptism. I don't believe in infant baptism. I don't believe anyone who is under the age of 18 is fit to be baptized. That's just my opinion. But, and if people ask about the whole thing where, people, the practice of child baptism was because the parents were afraid that if they didn't baptize their children right away, that they'd go to hell. And I said, I think that's putting God in a box, isn't it? That's kind of limiting to God. You're limiting the limitless one. But, I mean, their heart's in the right place. Just, disagree with them pretty strongly on this point. That, one should get educated in these matters and then get baptized. And the other place where I tend to disagree with Methodists is this comes from my family. My family didn't believe in open communion, and I don't believe in open communion either. I believe that communion is for baptized members of the church at large, meaning all Christendom, and not just that church, that building, but should be for those who've been baptized and those who aren't, stuck in some negative spiritual condition, I guess, as you could say, like grave sin or whatever. And obviously, as Methodists do a group confession or corporal confession before they take communion. And I mean, I do place a lot more value than some do on tradition. Although, like I've said, I've told people that although I do place a value on tradition, reason, and experience, I always say, you got to subordinate them to the scripture. So I do place more of a value on tradition than, say, your average Baptist or non denominational Christian. And as such, I'm a bit more high church or liturgically minded. And I understand this is a matter of preference, not a matter of dogma. But I think those traditions serve to make us clearly separate from the world. And, the world, we don't want to conform our churches or ourselves to the world. As Paul and James both said, we shouldn't try to kiss up to the world. We're here to bring the world to us. And, we shouldn't be part of the world. We should be God's people and be our own thing separate from the world. While, I mean, obviously, we can't leave the world entirely. It'd be terrible if a billion Christians decided to off ourselves. We should never do that. But we're here in this realm, this earthly realm, and we're here to bring people back to God. And how do we bring people back to God? By becoming like them. Jesus freak out.